Because of it, everything takes place as if Mount Analog did not exist. Supposing, in a moment I'll tell you why, the area in question is an island. You see, this is the island, there's Mount Analog. Here's how I'd have to draw the course of a ship going from A to B. Let's say we're aboard that ship. There's a lighthouse here at point B, and from A, I point a glass. You stay straight ahead in line with the ship's course. I see the lighthouse at B, whose light has made a detour around the side of the mountain because of the curvature of space. It's all very logical, isn't it, you see? And so I will never suspect that between the light and me lies an island covered with high mountains. I continue on course. The curvature of space deflects the light from the stars and also the lines of force in the Earth's magnetic field, so that in navigating with sextant and compass, I assume that I'm moving in a straight line. But you see, if you take an airplane, does it go in a straight line, or does it follow the curvature of the Earth? You see? So, without the rudder moving in the slightest, my ship and everything on board will be subject to the curvature and follow the contour deviation I have shown in this drawing from A to B. So even if this island is as big as Australia, it's understandable now that no one has ever suspected its existence. You see? So he goes on. Now, after some little discussion, to find a way of reaching the island, one must assume the possibility and even the necessity of reaching it. The only admissible hypothesis is that the shell, you see, that's all the way around it, this shell of curvature which surrounds the island is not absolutely impenetrable. That is, not always, not everywhere, and not for everyone. At a certain moment and in a certain place, certain persons, those who know how and wish to do so, can enter. The privileged moment we're seeking must be determined by a standard unit of time common to Mount Analog and to the rest of the world. Therefore, by a natural timepiece, very probably the course of the sun. This hypothesis is strongly supported by certain analogous considerations, and it is confirmed by the fact that it resolves another difficulty. Look back at this first drawing that he's given, and you notice how the lines of curvature rise and spread out through space, you see. And so, in that case, how could the sun send its rays down on the island from every point in its course? We're forced to the conclusion that the sun has the property of uncurving the space which surrounds the island. At sunrise and at sunset, it must in some way penetrate the shell, and through that same breach we shall enter. As he says, we all sat stunned by the audacity and logical power of this deduction. Everyone kept silent. And he goes on, a few theoretical points still seem obscure to me, so Gall went on. I cannot claim to understand perfectly the relation between the sun and Mount Analog, but he points out we have only to take up our position in line with the sunrise or sunset, exactly to the east or to the west, if it is at the solstice, and to await the proper moment. Then, for just a few minutes, as long as the solar disk remains on the horizon, the door will open, and I repeat, we shall enter. Well, then he postulates further. He says he'll explain further, but But really, he concludes why it is that from the west and not from the east that it is possible to enter. All Masons, please notice. It's both for a symbolic reason, because of the wind. We now have to examine the third question: where is the island situated? Well, we won't go into all of that. He does discover, he gives quite a calculation on that, and he discovers, indeed, he says he works it out, it's southwest of Tasmania and southeast of Tasmania and southwest of New Zealand, and it's just west of the island of Auckland. So I thought that's why, you see, I had to take you on this journey today, because it really isn't very far from here, is it, you see? That's why I thought I'd come over to Auckland and really see if somewhere along the way, you know, you might never have seen me if it had been the right moment and I were traveling from west to east, you see, and I'd gotten through, you'd find, you know, you wouldn't have seen me. I'd be there on Mount Analog, you see.
He hasn't in fact suggested this as a view of triangle.
He hasn't suggested that, you see. That's right. That's what you can get through. So, you see, here it is. And so, anyway, during the next week, various ones decide that they can't take the journey for various and sundry reasons. They all have good, you know, they're always the people with excuses that they're not about to get involved with the Theosophical Society right now, or having gotten, you know, heard a little bit about the calculations that we make, they decide to leave it, leave the ship. And so, they're right, you see? And so it ends up with these few. So on the 10th of the following October, we embarked aboard the ship, and the ship's name is the Impossible. There were 8 of us. I'm sorry, 4 dropped out, and there are 8 of us. A nice round number, you see? And here they are. The owner of the yacht, whose name is Arthur Beaver, wonderful name, Pierre Sogol, head of the expedition. They have a linguist, they have 2 brothers, they have a painter of mountain heights, my wife and I. And they'd agreed they weren't going to tell their friends anything about this journey. So now we're in the midst of the crossing. We've come to the 3rd chapter at this particular time. And he says, we were by no means cut out to be sailors. Several of us were seasick. Others who were never so much in command of their bodies as when hanging over an icy abyss were nevertheless unnerved by the little ship's long slidings down the watery slopes. The path to our highest desires often lies through the undesirable. Isn't that a marvelous statement, you see? And they have to, then the demands of intensive communal work bound us together as if we had been a single family, and a pretty rare family at that. Well, here they are, a branch of the Theosophical Society aboard the good ship, Impossible, or Theosophy if you like, and they're on their way. The crossing is made, and 8 stout hearts drummed from morning to night in time with a single all-encompassing desire, or some such lie. But the flame that kindles desire and illuminates thought never burned for more than a few seconds at a stretch. The rest of the time we tried to remember it. So, you know, this is pretty much true of us on our spiritual journey, isn't it, you see? And then Father Sogol tried to get up a few sort of games. He was an inventor of abstract symbols. And among other things, he told them how he had tried to measure thought. I think this is a little digression, perhaps, but it's interesting. He says, not the way psychotechnicians and testing experts go at it, limiting themselves to comparing the way one individual performs a certain activity with how others of that same age group perform it, and so on. But rather, what he was interested in, he said, was to find out really the how you measure, the real measurement. He said, in myself and in others, I began to observe how many numbers a man really can conceive, that is, carry in his mind without breaking them down or writing them down. How many successive consequences of a principle he can grasp at once, instantaneously. How many inclusions of species within genus. How many relations of cause to effect, of means to end. And I never found the number to be greater than 4. And moreover, this figure 4 required an exceptional mental exertion. Now, he does this in an interesting way, you see. Represent to yourself simultaneously the following facts. 1, I get dressed to go out. 2, I go out to catch a train. 3, I catch a train to go to work. 4, I go to work to earn a living. Now add a 5th step, and I'm sure that at least one of the first 3 will vanish from your mind. It's an interesting experiment. You can try it out, you see. Well, anyway, they spend quite a little bit of time doing all of this, and each of them, you know, devising little mental games and so on. And the days go by, and Sogol explains again why it's necessary to try to approach this invisible continent from the west, just at sundown, not from the east at sunrise. It's because at that moment, as in Franklin's experiment with the heated chamber, a cool offshore breeze must blow in towards the overheated lower layers of the atmosphere of Mount Analog. Thus we would be sucked in towards the interior, whereas at dawn, and from the east, we should be violently driven off. Furthermore, this result was symbolically predictable. Civilizations, in their natural process of degeneration, move from east to west. To return to the source of things, one has to travel in the opposite direction. Well, they reached the region where Mount Analog should be located, and they're just to the west of it. They had to grope around a little bit, and now they finally are sort of situated there in their little ship Impossible, and they swap stories of various kinds. They have some wonderful tales, including the tale of the hollow man and the bitter rose, but there isn't time to tell you that. You have to read this little book. And so they occupy themselves through the days. You see, the evening of the sun went down once again without opening the door of another world. One has to be patient, you know, not too hasty. Remember that in some of the other stories. And as he says, another question began to preoccupy them, and that is, you do not set out to acquire something in a foreign country without a supply of money. So this arises. And they began to sort of make up a list of all the things they had for purposes of barter, you see. Maybe they could barter with the inhabitants when they got there. And they began to sort of try to see what they had. But they said, in our relations with the superior beings of Mount Analog, what would be suitable for barter? What did we possess of real value? With what could we pay for the new knowledge we were seeking? Would we have to accept it as charity or on credit? Each one of us kept making his personal inventory, and each one of us felt poorer as the days went on, for no one saw anything around him or in him which really belonged to him. It reached the point we were just 8 beggars, possessing nothing, who each night watched the sun sink toward the horizon. Well, long expectation of the unknown lessens the final effect of surprise, because suddenly here they are on the island where rises Mount Analog. 3 days ago, just as the sun was going to disappear again over the horizon, while we waited tense in the bows with the sun behind us, a wind arose without any warning, or rather a powerful suction suddenly pulled us forward. Space opened ahead of us, a bottomless emptiness, a horizontal abyss of air and water impossibly entwined. The boat creaked in all its timbers and was hurled forward unerringly along a rising slope as far as the center of the abyss, and was suddenly set adrift in a wide, calm bay in sight of land. The shore was near enough for us to make out trees and houses, and higher up, cultivated fields, forests, meadows, rocks, and higher still, row after row of tall peaks and glaciers flaming scarlet in the setting sun. A flotilla of boats, each manned by 10 oarsmen, clearly Europeans, came out to tow us into an anchorage. It certainly seemed as though we were expected. Well, they discovered that there they are, you see. Who were we? Why had we come? Who are you? See, caught us these questions that they were asked. Each one had each one of the questions, all of them very simple. Who were we? Why had we come? Caught us completely off our guard. Seemed to probe our very insides. Who are you? Who am I? We could not answer as we would a police official or a customs inspector. Give one's name and profession. What does that mean? But who are you? And what are you? The words we uttered, we had none better, were worthless, repugnant, and grotesque as dead things. We realized that with the guides of Mount Analog, we could no longer get away with just words.
Got to be deeds.
Yes. So then they learn, actually, where they have landed is called the Port of Monkeys. And then they discovered that there were no natives there. All inhabitants have come from elsewhere. And there are little settlements of those who speak the same language as you do. And that's why it was the Europeans that brought them in, because they were from Europe. They were from Paris, you see. But they found that there were some others, many other little groups there. And so here we are on the island, and faced now, they discovered that none of our money had any value. That here on this island, first of all, that they're told that there is a unique stone which is perfectly transparent, sometimes called the Father of Diamond. Some say the word means Adam's stone. It's called a peridam, P-E-R-A-D-A. So the problem of money is solved by having peridams. And these are beautiful crystals, clear as can be, not easily found. And the only true means of repaying one's debt in full is in peridams. This perfectly transparent, its index of refraction so close to that of air, in spite of the crystal's great density, that the inexperienced eye barely perceives it. But to any person who seeks it with sincerity and out of true need, it reveals itself by a brilliant sparkle like that of a dewdrop. Peridam is the only substance, the only material thing whose value is recognized by the guides of Mount Analog. Therefore, it remains the basis and standard of all currency, like gold in many countries. They're rare, the search for them is difficult and even dangerous. It's often necessary to extract one from a fissure in the face of a precipice, or to pry one out of a sloping overhang of ice where it has embedded itself on the very lip of a crevasse. Therefore, after efforts that sometimes last years, many people become discouraged as they go up the mountain and go back down to the coast, where they look for easier means to pay back their debt. So that is how they begin to solve it. It's a little bit about language and some of the myths that they're there and the geological structure and so on, but of course they're very eager to get underway. But again, you remember, and they're very like the Grail legends, they become very much enamored of this place. It's a kind of lotus land, you see. And then suddenly they remember why they're there was to climb the mountain. We resolved to leave the next day at any cost. It was easier said than done. The next morning, everything was ready, but it began to rain in torrents. That's why I didn't think we should have Mount Analog yesterday, but today is a pretty good day, you see. And so, meanwhile, they've collected equipment, but the day that it rained, and it rained buckets for 5 days, so we were told that the roads and trails would be washed out. So the delay they put to use by examining all the equipment that they thought they should carry, and they decided to leave a lot of it behind, you see. It would and then it became apparent, the more that they looked at all of this and learned about it, it became apparent that our expedition would be long, very long. It would certainly last several years. So our oxygen supply would not be sufficient, and sooner or later we'd have to give it up. And we were assured that the only sure means of survival in the higher altitudes was to become gradually accustomed to the conditions. So they leave a lot of the stuff. They end up by being very thankful to the rain because it enabled them to really analyze what they were taking with them. They discovered also that during this time, as he said, we were beginning to shed our old personalities. So they're giving up a great deal. Now, it's at this point, too, that Pierre Saugal then tells them, I have brought you this far, and I've been your leader. Right here, I'll take off the cap of authority, which was a crown of thorns for the person I remember myself to be. Far within me, where the memory of what I am still is unclouded, a little child is waking up and making an old man's mask weep. A little child looking for mother and father, looking with you for protection and help, protection from his pleasures and his dreams, and help in order to become what he is without imitating anyone. So he is no longer the guide. And as he is speaking, he's delving in the sand with the point of a stick. And suddenly his eyes froze. He bent down and picked something up, something that shone like a tiny dewdrop. It was a paradigm, a small one, but the first for any one of us. Perhaps when we're willing even to shed that mask, we discover. So, as a last preparation, each of us, before going to bed, carefully made a little sack for future paradigms. And so we come to the setting up of the camp, of the first camp. The setting, this is the first camp. And since it is time for a break, I think this is where it ends. We'll come back and we'll read a bit about the setting up of the first camp and some of the laws that they begin the ascent, and then we'll see what we'll do with the final ones. come to chapter 5, just a few comments by Damal himself from the fragments that he left. Among the sort of outline that he has left for the story, he suggested that the true location of the story was at the junction between our humanity and a higher civilization, a place where a superior truth is perpetuated. And so he makes some comments about what he intended and says, by our calculations, thinking of nothing else, by our desires, abandoning every other hope, by our efforts, renouncing all bodily comfort, we gained entry into this new world. So it seemed to us. But we learned later that if we were able to reach the foot of Mount Analog, it was because the invisible doors of that invisible country had been opened for us by those who guard them. Those who see us, even though we cannot see ourselves, opened the door for us, answering our puerile calculations, our unsteady desires, and our awkward efforts with a generous welcome. But he also has learned one of the basic laws of Mount Analog. To reach the summit, one must proceed from encampment to encampment. But before setting out for the next refuge, one must prepare those coming after to occupy the place one is leaving. Only after having prepared them can one go on up. That is why, before setting out for a new refuge, we had to go back down in order to pass on our knowledge to other seekers. So we come to chapter 5, which ends in the middle, and as you remember, Sogol has given up. He knows that he can no longer be the leader. He is as unfamiliar with the mountain, in fact. And who is Sogol? Have you worked him out now? Logos, spelled backwards. If you look, that's why I put it on the board, you see. Can go only so far. But now there's a new guide, a guide who can only take them to the first camp, and his name is Bernard. So you can think about that for a little while too, you see, what it means to you. He can only go to the first camp because that's all the further he knows, and we'll see why that happens as we come to this 5th chapter. And the first camp is called Meadowbrook. He says, darkness still drifted around us under the fir trees, whose tops etched their fine writing against an already luminous sky. Lower down on the trunks, red tints appeared, and several of us saw the sky slowly open to show the pure washed blue of our grandmother's eyes. Little by little, the full spectrum of greens emerged out of the black, and every so often the fragrance of a beech freshened the smell of resin and contrasted with the scent of mushrooms. And so he talks about their moving on through this. Each of us carried his ration of provisions for the day and his personal effects. Several of us had some pretty weighty personal effects to carry in our hearts and minds as well. And they fall into a kind of rhythmic pattern as they move along towards the first camp. We were no longer in sight of the snow-covered summits, but only of wooded slopes cut by limestone cliffs, and down vistas through the forest to the right, the torrent at the bottom of the valley. At the last turn in the path, the ocean, whose horizon had continued to rise with us, had gone out of sight.